Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kennedy Center and the Millennium stage. This is our daily free performance series brought to you by Target. We are here 365 evenings a year at 6 o'clock to present the very best in music, dance, theater, and more. And if you're ever unable to join us in person, we invite you to visit us online at kennedy-center.org, where we broadcast each night's performance live and also make thousands of past performances available in our broadcast archive. And tonight we are, of course, very pleased to welcome back the Washington National Opera. And at this time, I'd like to introduce your host for the evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the principal vocal coach for the Washington National Opera, Ken Weiss.
Good evening, everybody. You know, we're accustomed to thinking of the stories that we hear in the theater, however moving or thought-provoking they might be, as just stories, just an evening's entertainment. But there are times in history where those stories burst out of the walls of the theater and they get involved in movements far, far beyond the world of the arts. They have a real impact on the culture at large. And the last two pieces in Washington National Opera's season both have stories that fall into that category. In Nabucco, you have a story that ends up becoming intimately involved with the Italian national movement for independence in the mid-19th century. And in Verteir, by Jules Massenet, Massenet retells a story that had a huge impact all over Europe. It became a touchstone for the generation of people who we know as the Romantics, people who viewed emotion as the driving force in life. Tonight, we're going to give you a little background about both those pieces, and we're going to give you a chance to hear some of the passionate music that each one of them contains. We're going to start by talking a little bit about Verdi's Nabucco, which is already open in the Kennedy Center Opera House and has 6 more performances until the 21st of May, including tomorrow night. Nabucco was Verdi's 3rd opera, and it was his breakout piece. It was the piece that made him a star. He had started off with a modest success called Oberto Conte di Bonifacio, and followed that up with a resounding flop called Un Giorno di Regno. He had been going through difficult personal time as well. He lost both his wife and his 2 children to illness. So he's in pretty desperate straits. His career is stalled. He's all alone. And this libretto for a piece called Nabucco is thrust upon him by the impresario who runs the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, a guy named Bartolomeo Merelli. And Verdi sets to work, and it becomes a great success for him. Now, Nabucco has its origin in 2 stories in the Bible. The first is the sack of Jerusalem by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who is Nabucco for short in Italian. Nebuchadnezzar II sacks Jerusalem in 597 BCE and takes a lot of the Israelites back to Babylon with him. This is what comes to be known as the Babylonian captivity. It's recorded in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and the book of Jeremiah. The other incident that is central to Nabucco is a story that gets told in the book of Daniel. It's in chapter 4 if you all want to follow along in your pew Bibles. And I'll read you a little bit of it. It says, "As the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, 'Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?' And even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven, 'This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes.' And immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled." The good news is that he eventually repents and is cured of his madness and restored to his kingdom and promises to glorify the God of Israel forever. So these are the 2 biblical accounts that are central to Nabucco. There's also a lot of stuff in Nabucco that you're never going to find in your pew Bible, so you can stop looking. And that's because the The show is not based directly on biblical sources, but it's based on a play and a later ballet that are built around those stories. In the play and the ballet and the opera, we have a family drama overlaid over those events. Nabucco in the play and the opera has two daughters who are never mentioned in the Bible, not once. A younger one named Fenena, who is Nabucco's favorite, and she falls in love with an Israelite and converts to Judaism. He also has an older daughter, Abigail, a warlike woman who's very, very resentful of her younger sister, and has a big chip on her shoulder because she discovers in the course of the action that she is not Nabucco's own child. She is the child of one of his wives by a slave. And that only increases her fear and her resentment and her hostility to Fenena. In the opera, Nabucco doesn't just try to claim credit for building a kingdom. He actually ups the ante and declares himself a god, and he's immediately stricken mad. And Abigail, the warlike older sister, sees her chance, and she imprisons him and takes advantage of his weakened state to get him to condemn all the Hebrews, including her younger sister, to death. And she seizes power for herself. This gives Verdi just the kind of situation he likes. He's got very strong, fierce, larger-than-life characters in really desperate situations, and it makes for some great, passionate music. And we're going to start our first example with Nabucco himself. This is the great aria that begins Act 4 of Nabucco. He is in prison. Chafing at his bars, he knows that his daughter Fenena has been condemned to death and is powerless to help her. And he finally begs forgiveness from the God of Israel, pledging that he will rebuild God's temples. And immediately his madness is lifted. He calls his trusty lieutenant Abdallo to get his weapons for him, and he says he will go off to save Fenena. We will hear this aria sung by baritone Leo An. At the piano will be Thomas Bagwell.
Prigioniero io sono Fatal, o t'aprirai. Signore, ove corri? Mi lascia uscir tu brami, perché insulti ognuno la tua mente offesa. Che parli tu? La mente or più non è smarrita. Appallo, il brando mio, per conquistare il soglio, eccolo il re. Salvar Felena io voglio. Seguitemi sabrellamente il giorno, a ardo di fiamme solitarie della stria io torno. Di questo brando al fulmine, cadendo gli empi, cadendo il suolo, tutto vedremmi colgere di mia corona il sol. Vedemmi colgere corona il sol, vedem tutto ripulgere di mia corona il sol, di mia corona il sol, vedem tutto ripulgere di mia corona il sol, di mia corona il sol, di mia corona il sol.
You heard, by the way, tenor Jeffrey Gwaltney appearing briefly, but effectively as Abdallo. There are lots of prayers in the action of Nabucco, not just Nabucco's. There are prayers for, of course, for the captive Israelites and for the leader Zachariah. And one of the most beautiful is for Finena, the younger daughter of Nabucco. She's condemned to death. She's going to be marched to the scaffold. And she sings a beautiful short aria at the end of Act 4. She says, "The heavens have opened, already my soul longs for the Lord. I bid farewell to the earthly stars, because God himself illumines me with his light. and already from this body that weighs it down, my soul longs to fly to heaven. The aria is called O dischiuso il firmamento. We'll hear it from mezzo-soprano Sarah Mesco. It's interesting, by the way, that playwrights in Verdi's time felt free to play fast and loose with the Bible story by adding characters who never appear in the Bible. You'd think that that would be a problem, but in fact there was a long-standing tradition, especially in Italian opera, of taking real historical figures and inserting them into imagined love triangles or other sorts of dramas. There was a precedent for it too. Rossini had written a great opera called Mosè in Egitto, Moses in Egypt, which has an invented subplot about the son of the Pharaoh being in love with an Israelite. So you could get away with quite a bit. The part of the story of Nabucco that really captures the imagination, though, of those who are interested in Italian independence is not the story about Nabucco and his children. It is the drama of the captive Israelites. And to understand why this was so resonant for them, you have to know a little bit about the politics of Italy in the mid-19th century. Italy, the phrase went at the time, was not a nation so much as a geographical expression, because there was no nation of Italy. Italy was divided into lots of little mini-states, mostly controlled by foreign powers, by the French, by the Spanish. The city of Milan was part of the area of Austrian control. And there had been movements to try to gain some measure of independence for Italy, or at least for some of the component states, since the 1820s, but they had always been ruthlessly suppressed. And certainly in 1840s Milan, when Nabucco was premiered, you couldn't speak openly about wanting Italian independence. In situations like that, theaters become safe places to talk about the things that are bothering you, like your oppression by foreign rulers, if you do it under the cover of allegory, if you do it by presenting a story that's about kicking out a foreign oppressor, but not the Austrians, say the ancient Babylonians. For example, wanting Italian independence in the Middle Ages. So librettists in the period start inserting lines that appeal to Italian patriots. There's a famous one in Verdi's Attila, which is from 1846. The librettist has a Roman general say to Attila the Hun, he says, "Avrai tu l'universo, resti l'Italia a me." You can have the whole universe as long as I get to keep Italy. Loud cheers from the audience. It's like putting applause lines in the State of the Union speech. Some things were just guaranteed to get a good response. The iconic piece in Nabucco that becomes involved in the movement for Italian independence, which is called the Risorgimento, is a chorus for the Hebrew slaves in Act 3 called Va Pensiero. The chorus begins, "Go my thoughts on wings of gold, and travel until you come to our native land where the sweet and gentle breezes blow." And the key lines are, "O mia patria si bella e perduta, o membranza si cara e fatal." "O my country, so beautiful and lost. O memory, so dear and so painful." Let's hear a little bit of it on recording. I think you'll recognize it right off. That's great. You all recognize that? Heard it before, some of you? It wouldn't be surprising because even today it has sort of the status of an Italian national hymn. Now, it's actually largely a paraphrase of the famous words in Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and yea, we wept as we remembered Zion." So there was nothing the censors could particularly object to. There is some controversy among scholars about whether this chorus was viewed as nationalistic at the time of Nabucco's premiere. Roger Parker, who edited the new edition of Nabucco, notes that there are no reports of it being censored or causing riots or being sung on the revolutionary barricades. But you can imagine that if you were one of those people in the audience who was chafing for Italian independence, you would strongly identify with the captive Israelites and their longing for a homeland. And in fact, our production, directed by Thaddeus Strasberger, tries to imagine how this text and this opera would have affected an Italian company performing in the 1840s under Austrian rule. What is certain is that by the 1860s and 70s, when the modern state of Italy finally came into being, Va Pensiero had become an iconic piece of music, so much so that it attained the status of a national hymn. If you want to hear all of it, and more of this great passionate music that Verdi composed, you have a chance tomorrow night and 5 performances after that through May 21st. And now let's turn to Massenet's Verteir, which is equally high drama but on a much more intimate scale. It's based on a famous novel by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe from 1774 called Die Leiden des jungen Werther, the sorrows or the sufferings of young Werther. And it's a story about a guy who cannot fit in. A very intelligent, very well-educated bourgeois fellow, a sometime artist and writer. He ends up, for obscure sort of family reasons and maybe to get away from a romantic entanglement at home that he didn't want, in a small town in western Germany called Wetzlar. And he cannot find a place to fit in the town. He doesn't find anybody in this small place who shares his interests, except for one family. He finds a family of a local official, a royal steward, who has recently lost his wife, but has a large group of children who are cared for very lovingly by the eldest sibling, a woman named Charlotte. And Verteir finds a sort of new home in this family, and he falls deeply, deeply in love with Charlotte. But he learns she is engaged to a young man named Albert. This throws Verteir into a crisis, because Charlotte's house, the one place he felt at home, is now a place of torment to him. And the things that usually comfort him, his love of nature and his ideas of God, they all fall away from him. And he's left prey to his stormy emotions. And they become ever more violent. He starts to behave erratically. He bursts out in passionate diatribes at inappropriate times. He scares the children. He makes Charlotte and Albert, who want to keep him as a family friend, very uncomfortable. He tries to leave. He goes away to become a civil servant at the court in Weimar, but he finds he doesn't fit there either, because as a bourgeois, the nobility won't accept him. He ends up back in Wetzlar, and he has a final disastrous meeting with Charlotte. They get to talking, they get to reading poetry, and they are caught up in reading the verses of a poet named Asean, and before she knows that she is in his arms, before things get too far, she's horrified by what she's done. She runs away from him, and Verteir realizes that things cannot go on like this. So he writes a note to her husband, Albert, and tells him he is going on a journey, and he asks him to lend him a pair of pistols for the journey. When he gets the pistols, he goes back to his home and puts one of them to his temple and ends his life. Most of this novel is written as a series of letters from Verteir to a friend. So you get a first-person, very, very intimate view of the emotional struggles that he's going through. And this description of a soul in torment had a tremendous impact all over Europe. All over Europe, for example, young men adopted the costume that Verteir is described as wearing in the novel, which is a blue long coat and a yellow waistcoat and breeches. More disturbingly, there were reports of a rash of suicides in imitation of Verteir. So much so that now, even today, when there is a wave of copycat suicides, it's called the Verteir effect. Goethe's novel seems to have captured the imagination of the people of his time because he sensed, Verteir senses, that everyone is living in an age of upheaval. Old ideas about God and old routines of life have fallen away in the 18th century. And the new ideals of logic and reason that come with the Enlightenment don't seem sufficient to make up the gap. People are still deeply disturbed and have nowhere to rest, nothing to hang on to, and they're buffeted ever more by their emotions. And Goethe's Verteir becomes a touchstone for the Romantic movement. Goethe's Verteir is the ancestor if you will, of a whole series of tormented, obsessive lovers who dominate German romantic music for the next century. The heroes of Schubert's song cycles, die Schöne Müllerin and Winterreise, of Schumann's Dichterliebe, of Mahler's The Songs of a Wayfarer, among others. Massenet comes to Verteir in the 1880s. Now, he tells a story about how he came to write the piece in his memoirs. The memoirs may not be very reliable, but it's a really good story, so we'll tell it here anyway. He was on a trip to Bayreuth to see Parsifal with his manager, a guy named Hartmann. And they went, after seeing Parsifal, to Wetzlar to see the house where Goethe himself had lived. And while they were there, Hartmann supposedly pressed a French translation of Verteir into his hand. And Massenet tells this wonderful story. He says they went into a beer hall and ordered 2 giant bocks and sat down, and he said the air was full of smoke because everybody around them had a porcelain pipe with lots of students. And he says that he sat there completely absorbed in the burning passion that radiated off the pages of this book. And he became convinced that he had to set this story to music. Massenet and his librettists focus the story down, so it's really just about the love story between Verteir and Charlotte, and all the stuff about his attempts to fit in with larger society go away. They do keep lots of other details from Goethe. They hew pretty closely to the story. Let's hear a couple of examples from the show. We'll start with a duet for Charlotte and Vertier that comes at the end of Act 1. Charlotte and Vertier are just returning from a walk. They've come back to Charlotte's house, and it's about time for them to part. Vertier is obviously already deeply enamored of Charlotte, and he's dancing around telling her about it. He comes awfully, awfully close. He admires the care that she takes of her younger siblings, and that sets her to thinking about her mother. And she talks a little bit to Verteir about how much she misses her mother and how hard the loss of her mother has been on her younger siblings. And this devotion makes Verteir only love her the more. He flies into ecstasies, and he finally comes out and says it. He says, "I love you." And at that moment, there is a voice from off stage. It is Charlotte's father telling her that Albert has come back. And Verteir says, "Who's Albert?" And he finds out that Albert is the man that Charlotte is engaged to marry. And to her face, he takes it very, very nobly, and he says, "You must honor this vow." But left alone, he cries out in agony, another will be her husband. So we'll hear the duet of Charlotte and Vertier from Act 1. As Charlotte, you'll hear mezzo-soprano Erin Elizabeth Smith. As Vertier, tenor Alex Richardson. Again at the piano, Thomas Bagwell.
Les étoiles et le soleil peuvent bien dans le ciel tour à tour apparaître. J'ignore si les jours, j'ignore si les nuits. Mon être demeure indifférent à ce qui n'est pas toi.
Mais vous ne savez rien de moi.
Mon âme a reconnu votre âme, Charlotte, et je vous ai vu assez pour savoir quelle femme vous êtes.
Vous me connaissez.
Vous êtes la meilleure, ainsi que la plus belle des créatures. Faut-il que j'en appelle à ceux que vous nommez vos enfants?
Hélas, oui, mes enfants. Vous avez livré ce que l'image de ma mère méprisante tout le monde ici. Et courage, je crois voir sourire son visage quand je prends soin de ses enfants. Mes
Oh, Charlotte, ange dit de boire la bénédiction du ciel sur toi repose.
Si vous l'avez connu, autre chose de voir si Verdi se qu'on a de boucher.
verrò.
Charlotte, Albert,
Albert,
Oui, celui que ma mère m'a fait jouer dans cet ébrieux. Dieu, mettez-moi qu'un instant près de vous. J'avais oublié le serment qu'on me rappelle.
à ce serment, restez fidèle. Moi, je mourrai, Charlotte. À l'autre, son épaule.
Charlotte's oldest sibling is a cheerful young woman named Sophie, and through much of Act Two, she does her best to cheer Werther up, because he always seems so gloomy. She comes in towards the beginning of the act with a bunch of flowers she's just picked and finds him with his usual long face, and says to him, the sun is shining, and the birds that fly up to heaven, all of this tells us that God permits us to be happy. We'll hear Sophie's aria. It's called Duet Soleil. We'll hear soprano Jae-gyung Yang. I mentioned earlier that Goethe's Verteir is constructed as a series of letters. And Massenet's librettist managed to capture a little bit of that in a great scene for Charlotte, where she is reading some letters she's received from Werther. Werther has gone away in an effort to cool things down, and she reads 3 letters in the course of this aria, which is called the letter scene, apparently, normally enough. The first of the letters he describes being alone in his room as the gray sky presses down on his soul like a shroud. In the second letter, he talks about hearing the cries of children outside his room and how it makes him think of the happy times he spent with Charlotte and her family. The third letter is the one that scares her. He says to her, "You told me that I should return at Christmas time, and I said to you, never. And we will find out which of us was right. But if I do not return, do not accuse me. Weep for me. Moisten this letter with your tears. O Charlotte, tu frémiras. O Charlotte, you will tremble." We'll hear the letter scene from Verteir with mezzo-soprano Erin Elizabeth Smith. We're going to finish up this evening's performance with Werther's great aria, Pourquoi me réveiller? You recall that in his last disastrous meeting with Charlotte, they fall to reading poetry. The poetry they're reading is the poetry of Asean. Now it's interesting that Verteir, who would value emotional authenticity above all things, should pick Asean as one of his favorite poets because Asean was a big 19th century fake. Asean was supposed to be a medieval Scottish bard, but in fact he seems to have been the creation of his discoverer, a fellow named James Macpherson. It's still pretty good stuff, very passionate stuff. But what Macpherson seems to have done is cobbled together bits of old Gaelic poems, a little like J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, and then passed them off as the work of this medieval Asean. At any rate, the poem that Verteir falls to reading is called Pourquoi me réveiller? Why do you wake me? And it goes in part, why do you wake me of breath, O breath of spring? I feel your gentle caress on my forehead, but I know that the time of storms is fast approaching. Tomorrow, the traveler in the valley will look in vain for my past glory. We'll hear tenor Alex Richardson in Pourquoi me réveiller from Werther.
Pourquoi me réveiller au souffle du printemps? Pourquoi me réveiller sur mon front je sens des caresses et pourtant bien proche le temps des orages et des tristesses. Pourquoi me réveiller au souffle du Demain dans le vallon viendra le voyageur, se souvenant de ma gloire première, et ses yeux vainement chercheront ma splendeur. Ils ne trouveront plus que deuil et que misère. Hélas, pourquoi me réveiller au souffle du printemps?
There's lots more wonderful, passionate music where that came from. And you can hear it in Washington National Opera's production of Massenet's Verteir. It opens May the 12th and runs through May the 27th, 7 performances. Nabucco is running right now through May the 21st. I want to thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. Thank you to our performers, and we look forward to seeing you at the opera.